let me start. I'll take you way back, about 30 years, all right? 30 years. I was editing an Asian business magazine, and I was put in to run the magazine. It was coming out of London, printed in Singapore, and going all around the Asian region. This is way before I got involved in television. And I thought, well, I know a bit about Asia, but I need to know about all the countries that encompass that bit of the world. So I started to put folders together in a big filing cabinet and collect newspaper cuttings on Singapore, on Hong Kong, on Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan, Mongolia as well. And I found that my files on Hong Kong were growing like this, and Malaysia were growing. My Mongolia file was very, very small. I mean, there wasn't a lot of coverage of Mongolia. And I began to get interested in why there wasn't that coverage, right? So I went to the BBC, and I applied to the BBC, and they took me on as a producer for business programs. And that, of course, took me to Russia, and it took me to China. And I thought, I still don't know enough about this bit that's in between the two. At that time, I couldn't convince the BBC to send me to Mongolia. And it took me leaving the BBC for them to convince that I should go to Mongolia. So I've become editor of BBC World's business programs. I launched a program on BBC Two. We launched a business program on BBC One, and I went for the editorship of the Money program, which is the big flagship financial program that the BBC used to do. And I didn't get the job. And I thought, maybe that's a sign. Maybe I need to be moving out of the BBC. So, much to my wife's distress, because we had our first daughter, I left the secure environment of the BBC and set up a company with a partner. And we were wondering, how would we launch this company in a crowded market where there's, media in London is a very crowded place? What would I do that would be something different? And I remembered my little Mongolia file. And I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to organise a filming trip to Mongolia. And I'm going to make sure that the BBC takes some of my films, and I'm going to sell films to other broadcasters. Well, as it turned out, the BBC bought every film I made on that trip. So I made a half-an-hour programme on Nadam, which is my first experience of archery and wrestling and horse riding. I tried a wooden saddle, but it was difficult for me. I took a big crew over from the UK, and we made a whole series of films. And we also made radio programs. So we went to a nightclub and made about Black Rose, this emerging rap group in Mongolia at that time. And we did features on Mongolian food, and we did features on Mongolian sport. We did features on the landscape and the extraordinary landscape that you have. We even did a feature on a mathematician who came to my hotel room on my first trip. I can't remember which. I was staying at the Tushin Hotel. Tushin on Subbati Square. Yeah. And he came to my hotel and said, look at this. And it was a book of mathematical formula. And he said, I have solved the theory of everything, which combines relativity and quantum mechanics. And look at this. So, of course, I struggled to get an O-level in mathematics, so how am I going to judge whether he has or not? But so I found myself taking back with me and I took it to Imperial College, where I had a link.
What's his name? Elчин.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And he came to breakfast with me. And the Imperial College looked at it and they said, well, it'll take us 5 years to go through all of this, so it's going to take a while. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So I met the British ambassador in UB at that time, John Durham. And John said to me, it would be great for people like you to come and help train Mongolian journalists and train them onto television news programs and things like that. And then we had an interview with the president, Bagabandi, at that time.
Yeah.
And I said to the president, can you explain to me why every news bulletin I see, the president is always the main story? Because I said, in an emerging, developing democracy, we need to get away from that Soviet idea and do stories based on news value, not status. So he said, well, this is just the sort of thing we are beginning to get a growing media, a crowded media here, and we're learning our way. It's difficult. So he asked me to go and talk to Mongolia State Radio and Television. It's a huge office, just outside UB, I remember where it was, and there was lots and lots of rooms, and it reminded me of being at the BBC, because you know, it was, there were so many people working there. They introduced me to the guy who edited the evening news programme. I think it was on at 9 o'clock. And they showed me, and I said, whilst I've been here in Mongolia, I've been studying Eagle TV, Mongolian State TV, is there UB TV? There was UB TV, yes, yeah. There wasn't channel C1 at that time. And I've been looking at how you put together news programmes. And he said, come with me and talk to my journalists. So, and then they asked me to edit that evening's news. And they had a story about the president meeting a trade delegation from Austria. And that was the lead story. And I said, that's not a lead story. The fact that there was a discussion about a new import tax of all goods coming into Mongolia. And I said, I'll just give you one example. When you go home tonight and you sit with your family and you're having a meal, do you say to each other, the president met a delegation from Austria today, or do you say, do you know, by tomorrow everything that we bring into this country is going to be more expensive, so the cost of living will go up? And I said, it's obvious, isn't it? That's the main story. That's what you should be doing. So they let me work with the journalists to develop the news bulletin as I would do it if I was at the BBC. Now, I know that there are cultural differences, and I'm not criticising it. I'm simply saying a news programme is based on news values. It's not based on the status or authority or who is deciding what the news is. So the president, with the backing of the president, the ambassador, John Durham, contacted the British Foreign Office, and the British Foreign Office funded me to go back the next year and do a series of training courses with Mongolian television journalists and also with television presenters. So all the famous presenters, all the most glamorous women were in the same room with me, you know. So when we went to lunch, we could stop the traffic in UB because all these faces were recognised, okay? And I worked with them to make sure that their presentation skills were getting better, their interview skills were getting better, and how to assess what is a good story and what isn't a good story and how you do it. Now, of course, all of those channels had different politicians and they were aligned to different parties, weren't they? So there was a conservative channel, if you like. So it wasn't like, they said Mongolian State Radio and TV is like the BBC, and I said it isn't, not yet, but it might be better, but anyway, it wasn't at that stage. So they said to me that you've got to understand that whoever is paying for the channel gets the news on there. And I said that's a real problem, you know, because people want to have news that they can trust and news that they value. And if they feel that they're watching a propaganda news programme, then it isn't news. It's simply a manifesto, you know. It's a fascist manifesto you were talking about, that's what it is. So they said, we've got a lot to do here on Mongolia. And I said, I'm loving this country, I'm very happy to come back again. So the next year I went back and I did another huge course with lots of Mongolian journalists, with lots of Mongolian presenters, where we did trial news programmes. So we got out of the classroom and we would make our own news programme which we put on air in the classroom almost. It wasn't in the studio even. We made the studio up. So, and I said, this is a serious, I know this is a classroom activity, but this is a serious activity as well. We want to, as if we're going live, and I won't take any excuses if your story is not ready. We go on air immediately at 7 o'clock as if we were going live to the nation. And I drove the journalists to get their filming done, to get their writing done, to get their editing done, so that we could actually put it on air as if I was doing the 10 o'clock news here on BBC One. And sometimes we were successful, sometimes we weren't. But what I did do was then the following morning, I would analyse all the stories that we'd done, how we did those stories, whether we moved the stories on, because there was an absolute mania, I suppose. Television news in Mongolia at that time, and I hope it's changed, would show endless press conferences. So you would have a room like this with the delegate sitting here, the MP or whoever it was, the VIP person, and so the camera would have a shot around the room, and then it would have a close-up of me, and I would perhaps be saying something, and then it would have another shot of people in the room. And I said, that is not coverage. It's not television. What I want you to cover is what's being talked about, not what I'm looking at in the room. So, and they said, well, I always had that idea that I was pushing them too far. And they said, well, you don't understand Mongolia. I said, I'm beginning to understand Mongolia a lot, I must say. And there's a lot of things that I think you do brilliantly, but there are other things that could be done a whole lot better. During the third visit, I was introduced to a man who was the Mongolia's Olympic representative for judo. I think you know who I'm talking about. Yeah, and I was staying at the hotel that he owns. I don't know whether he still owns it. It was not the 4 or 5-star one, which was never really 5-star, was it? But anyway, it was an older building, I remember. That's it. That's where I was staying. And he said, I've got a special meal for you. So one evening, he'd been fishing. So I had fish for the first time in Mongolia. I thought this was luxury, I thought, yeah. And we sat together, and he told me about his ideas for a television channel that wouldn't. Now, I always knew that he was setting out a political career, but he wasn't then. He was a very successful businessman who, it was a sort of, as I get it, an intermediary between Russia and China, really. That's how he made a lot of his money. Yeah. And he said, I want to set up this channel, called Channel, we call it, I think I said, call it Channel 1 then, if it's the first channel you wanted to be, so easy. And we went to see a number of sites that he owned, and then I think it was in an old supermarket that in UB where he decided that he would open the channel. So he asked me to come up with all the ideas of how the channel could work, how it could be different. For example, you didn't really have breakfast television, you didn't have a program on in the morning. We were told Mongolians are too busy to watch TV in the morning. Well, we're all too busy, so I said that you can change that, and they could get their information as soon as they wake up. And so I came up with the first template of how Channel 1 would operate, and then Batuka invited me back to do a series with all the staff that were coming in to help recruit people, to develop the programming. And Ben Moyles, yes, was in charge of Channel 1. And his father, this is an amazing story, his father set up something called Fourth World Travel, specialising in Mongolia. And you could go to the lakes and have a beautiful time. And Ben was his son. And I was at a Mongolian embassy reception here in London, and it was time for questions, and Ben's father stood up and asked a question from Fourth World Travel. Now, the name of my company was Fifth World. So we had the fourth world and the fifth world unknowingly sitting next to each other, right? And I said, you could not make this up, could you? So Fifth World was introduced to the fourth world, and I can't remember Ben's father's name now, but I think it was John. But he said, you must meet Ben when you go to Mongolia. So that was how the connection came about. Ben no longer works for Channel 1, I know that, but he operates I think it's called Mongolian Fixers, for all international crews coming into Mongolia. He will help set up the filming schedule for them. And he continues to do that to this day, because I had a brief communication with him. So I've got a sort of link to the development of Mongolian media, and I could see where, you know, what was the channel where it was largely American missionaries? Eagle TV. So they brought in basketball games, and then in between you'd have the sermon about whatever. Was it Mormon, or was it? It could be anything, couldn't it? It could be anything, whatever it was. But you know, I thought, well, I can see why Eagle TV. But then you were invaded by missionaries. I don't know why suddenly they felt Mongolia was the place, but as soon as I arrived in Mongolia on my very first visit, checked into the Tushin Hotel, walked down, I was going to have a look at the Friendship department store. I don't know why the book said I should go to a department store, but I was walking down there. Two American women stopped me and said I looked lost, and I said, well, that's because I am lost, by the way. And then took me for a cup of coffee, and they were from the Peace Corps. And they were there to try and convert as well. So it became a centre for conversion, you know. I was hoping to present the opposite argument, why you shouldn't convert and just stick to being Mongolian, but anyway. Eagle TV then was a very popular channel, because people liked basketball, wasn't I? Is it? Yes, yeah. They brought in games and you watched that, and you played basketball in Mongolia as well. So I was surprised when, in my researches, because remember I hadn't been to Mongolia for 10 years, in my researches I watched a video about media called Young Media in Mongolia, and it featured an interview with Eagle TV and not Channel 1, I think it was the UBTV, I can't remember which one it was. Anyway, they were talking about the culture and the practice of news programming in Mongolia. And you've now got a fully functioning free press, and that is a great thing to have, but unfortunately it's driven by money, as you were talking about as well. So the lady from Eagle TV said that politicians buy coverage on our news programs. I thought that was horrific, you know. So you've got now a free press which is now deeply competitive, and I don't know about your press regulation yet. I'll find that out about press regulation. But you as viewers don't know the value of what you're watching if it's been bought, you know. So you've got a commercial problem where you used to have a sort of propaganda problem. You've now got a commercial problem, because it's either what the president says or what the main authority says, I want you to watch. A North Korea approach, let's say. Or it's the commercial environment with people desperate to survive and keep the money flowing into the channel, like Eagle TV and others. And so they'll do all sorts of deals. So you are a functioning democracy, whatever you think. You are a functioning democracy, and but you've now got vested interests. Well, there are vested interests here, aren't there? Newspaper owners like Rupert Murdoch and the Barclay brothers who own the Daily Telegraph all have, and the Daily Mail, not far from here, they all have a great interest in Britain leaving the European Union, because they're proprietors think that that's how we should operate. So the proprietor thinks this, and therefore the newspaper publishes it. So there is a special argument and line that they pursue. You don't want to go against your proprietor. So we have a press regulator here who will, and we have a stronger regulator for television called Ofcom, where in TV the culture of impartiality is sort of embedded in what they do. You can't have Paul Dacre editing the Daily Mail saying what I think is what I want to put in my newspaper. Channel 4 News doesn't operate like that. ITV News doesn't operate like that, and nor does the BBC. You might think that the BBC is the voice of the government, but I can tell you honestly and completely that it isn't. It doesn't operate like that. We can upset the government as much as we can upset the opposition. In fact, we always used to think the BBC was doing the right sort of job if it upset both, if we got complaints from Labour and from Conservatives. So there is, I think for Mongolia now, it's a question of regulation now, of getting the systems in place which don't allow exploitation of editorial principles. Now, you must bear in mind that I haven't been there for 10 years, so I'm thinking it's about time I went back. But there's all sorts of issues now, I think, that we could develop with training of young journalists within the television industry, within the print industry, and online, which is crucial to people getting information about Mongolia. And I'm thinking about that when I met on Saturday the previous ambassador, John Durham. I gave a talk about Mongolia and my experiences at my local village church. And it was a fundraising evening because the church wants to hold concerts there, and as I was explaining, it doesn't have any toilets. A prerequisite for a concert is to have toilets and facilities for the audience. So they were holding a fundraising evening. Now, this is an amazing story. I really thought it would be very nice for me to invite the former ambassador, British ambassador to Mongolia, to this evening, because John and I got on very well, but he's now retired from the Foreign Office. So I didn't quite know how I would contact him. I sent an email to HR in the Foreign Office and thinking, this is never going to work. That was on the Monday, right? On the Wednesday evening, I was walking down Victoria Street on my way to Victoria Station when John Durham was coming towards me. 2 days, I've never tried to contact him, but 2 days after the email was sent, the man who I wanted to speak to was walking towards me. So I thought this must be Mongolia working in a very mysterious way. I said, John, you just won't believe what I'm about to tell you, but I want to invite you to my talk. I was trying to contact you, and now you're walking there. And his wife was there, Shan, who was very active with very numerous charities in Mongolia when she was there. They were both there together, and they both agreed to come to the evening. And John held a question and answer session, and in fact he wants to come and talk to your group sometime. I said I would mention him, and he lives in South London now. He could live anywhere in the country, but he lives in South London, and he often comes up to Victoria Station, and Victoria Station is where I go out to my home in Kent. That's how it all happened. It's a bit like, I remember a bus journey in Mongolia, and I was with the crew, and we were going out through a landscape that seemed to be not significant, and we'd given a lift to a lady who was going to visit her family, I think, or out of UB. And the landscape hadn't really changed as far as I was concerned for half an hour, but she said, I need to be dropped here. And I couldn't see anything around, And then she got off the bus and walked in that direction, knowing that her nomadic family would be over there somewhere, because she knew the landscape. And then I was told, you are experts in memory. you are the world's experts in remembering things. In memory competitions, Mongolians almost always come first because you have that visual memory. Because you can't see, well, there's no signs, there's no trees, there's no, you just have to remember where it all is. So John Durham said to me after the event, we must get you back there. We must get you back to Mongolia, and you must go and talk to them about the development of media now that it's gone from where you were 20 years ago to where you are now. But before we do that, at the end of the talk, lots of people came up to me. I showed paintings, I showed a film of a musician doing Humi singing. I explained about some of my experiences drinking vodka in Mongolia. Not great experiences, I must say. The great vodka, it's just it doesn't agree with me, that's all. And people came up to me afterwards, and about 9 or 10 people said, we've never even considered going to Mongolia before, but suddenly we want to go. We want to. So, irrespective of media now, I'm telling you that I think there's a huge tourism potential for Mongolia, which could. Okay, I'm basing it on 9 people, so forget that for the moment. But you've got a big message to tell to people, and the more that they learn, the more attracted they are to finding out more about this country. You're not helped by Unreported World, which you must have seen on Channel 4, where it deliberately set out to point out how bad the air pollution is in UB. And it didn't say where it was all down to the burning of wood and the stoves and the pollution. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't pollution, because there is, but surely you would know. UB's set in a sort of bowl, isn't it? And there's one power station there and one here. So the pollution drops into it. So I would have thought a solution is your power station, move it, that's what you've got to try and do. But because it is one of the cleanest and most spectacular landscapes I've ever come across. I'll tell you one extra thing as well. I was asked to do a film on the Erdenet copper mine. And I got the train from UB up to Erdenet, and we made a 15-minute film when there was discussion about Erdenet being floated publicly, and perhaps they wanted to bring in more investors. It was a joint Russian-Mongolian venture, wasn't it, I think? Yeah. But they obviously enjoyed the crew and what we were doing, because on the train journey back, we were given our own carriage that was put on at the end of the train. So we had our own luxury carriage. Well, it wasn't luxury, but it was okay, it was good. It was our own personal one, for us to go back to UB. And it's those sort of experiences that means that I have a soft spot in my heart for Mongolia. Doing the talk has only emphasised that. So just to round up, I think that the training of journalists is absolutely critical to the proper functioning of a society. Now, this is a really serious note here, but you can't have a proper functioning society without a free press. And that free press is there to hold your government, your politicians, your companies, your institutions accountable. If they can't do it, who can? So if you have a situation in Russia where Putin decides precisely who and what can be covered, there is no free press in Russia. It's controlled by, if not Putin, his billionaire friends. We have a situation here in the UK where many multi-millionaires pay to own media organisations, but there are sufficient numbers of independent media for the argument still to be maintained that press is free and that they can attack them without the fear of imprisonment or fines or being closed down. Now, from what I hear, the politicians are the kings in Mongolia, and they control a lot of things to do with the media, to do with people's livelihoods. So they have to be held accountable. And that's why I invented a program called People and Power for Al Jazeera. It was, the principle was that it was about the use, and it can be good, not always bad, and abuse of power. It was holding companies as huge as Coca-Cola to account. So we ran a film about Coca-Cola's activities in Rajasthan in India, where they'd put the bottling plant in an area which is short of water. And so it added to the shortness, the scarcity of the water, because they lied about how much water this factory would use. And we found their figures, and we got the actual figures, and we did a report on it, and Coca-Cola insisted on a right of reply and sent someone over from Atlanta to the UK, where we had studios for Al Jazeera then, and we examined what their argument was, and they lost the argument, and they didn't sue us, you know. But without those voices saying, hang on a minute, societies can get out of control, and you can have, and you haven't got great examples with your neighbours. So you have a president forever now in Xi Jinping, and I'm about to go to China to make a documentary about him. And you've got a president who finds new ways of staying in power in Russia as well. So you're a big country, but a small population squeezed between all of that. And my argument is that a free press helps the proper operations of a country, and it helps that power, however it's practiced, can be held accountable by the press that you have. So if I have one wish for Mongolia, it's that news isn't bought, that, you know, that politicians aren't allowed to buy news, that the politicians, you know, when you watch a certain TV channel, it has a certain point of view, but you need to be able to trust the news. And I'm BBC trained, and whatever you think of the BBC, and it has many problems, it is impartial. It does not follow any particular political line, and most people who think it does come from one side or the other, and they will only find evidence that supports their ideas. They don't look for things that disprove their ideas, it's just supporting it. Yeah. And I can tell you from an insider's point of view that no one controls what the BBC puts on its news broadcasts. It decides what it puts on its broadcasts. And no one can influence that from the outside. You can influence it from the inside, but ultimately the BBC's editors decide what's going on there. Sometimes they get it wrong, but mostly they do get it right. I'm open now, hello, to questions, because I've given you a sort of thumbprint of my experience and my experience of Mongolia. So if you'd like to ask me anything else about my experiences, or catch me out on something I've said, well, now's the opportunity.
Okay.
Who appoints the chairman of the BBC, the top-ranking official?
Who appoints? The top of the BBC is the Director General. The Director General is appointed by a council of the BBC, within the BBC.
The president or chairman of the council, who is appointed the chairman of the council?
The BBC board.
Okay.
The BBC board are volunteers that come in and they're appointed for a period. And then they will elect the Director General, and the chairman will come out of that.
Volunteers, did your council members just come in there like volunteers?
They're chosen. There's Diane Coyles, for example, is an economist from the city. So, and there will be a banker on that board as well. So that it has a board of governors.
So you're absolutely sure the chairman is not appointed by government?
Oh, yeah, I'm absolutely sure that it's not appointed by government. Yeah, yeah. It would be the national scandal if the chairman was appointed by government. You know, we had an incident where the chairman was Duke Hussey, who came from Times newspapers, and people thought that he was straight from the Conservative Party. But actually he proved to be very anti-conservative as well, so, and a very great defender of the BBC.
There was an appointment in January 2017. What was that related to BBC chairmanship? Let me get into the internet.
Yeah, you tell me. I'll answer.
There was something happened in 2017 January. I vaguely remember that.
Yeah. Was it to do with the Director General? Oh, I think I know what you mean. George Entwistle was the Director General.
It's David Clementi.
Yeah.
Sir David Clementi has been confirmed and appointed by Prime Minister as a BBC chairman. January indeed, 2017, last year.
Well, but he can't be appointed by the Prime Minister.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't know where that comes from, but the BBC is not the voice of government, and never has been. It might be funded by a licence fee, which is set by the government, so there is a direct influence there between the financing of the BBC and the practice of the broadcaster. But the BBC is not controlled by what Theresa May wants. I don't have to give you evidence of that. Just look at the news programmes. There'll be a lot of things that they put on there that she would not be happy with. There will be some things that she would be happy with. Is that an issue in Mongolia?
Yes.
Who controls what?
Yeah. Common House controls everything.
The government controls everything.
Yeah, everything is appointed by the Common House.
Right.
We don't have locals.
Right.
Common House acts like Local House and acts like a judge and acts like a media, everything.
Right. Right.
Actually, it's the total power of the
Yeah.
Common House.
Yeah. But you can vote for your government, can't you? You can vote them out of power, as you can vote them into power.
But there is no choice. Only two parties, like Labour Conservative.
Yeah.
There is no choice. They both have same attribute.
Yeah.
It doesn't care who they are. Because of the attribute, they does exactly the same thing.
Right.
That's what I've seen in Britain when I was in GC. All the GC engineers, they're not happy. They don't want to involve with the elections. And I asked them why. They said, the both of them cheaters, lies.
Yeah.
They don't like manipulate.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, what do you want? Do you want them, both of them cheat lies, or just one who has total control? You know,
Yeah.
so it's not China, is it?
Yeah.
You know, so and China, you don't even get a vote. I mean, they have the People's Congress, which is a representative of every different ethnic, 52 ethnic groups that make up China. But it's not a debating chamber. It's simply there to do that. Yeah, that's all they want to do. So maybe it does, but Mongolia is more than that, would you say?
Sorry, say again?
Is the Mongolian parliament somewhere where you can have genuine debate about issues that affect the country?
I understand.
Don't know. Okay, let me ask you something about BBC.
Right.
I know it's independent in terms of politics, right? Independent from government in terms of politics. How about in terms of economy, finance?
Yeah. You mean how it is an institution is financed?
Yeah.
Because the licence fee is enshrined as the way that the BBC is financed, right? But the government can set the level of the licence fee. So, in a way, that sort of controls what the BBC can do, because whatever money it's got dictates what it can do. So the licence fee is the least worst way of funding a state broadcaster, but it's not a state broadcaster. It's the BBC. So it can, if it wants to, raise money commercially. BBC World is not controlled by the licence fee. BBC World is the commercial arm of the BBC, and it sells programmes all over the world. So Top Gear, when it was in its prime, used to be sold to about 90 countries, I think. So it earned a lot of money. The BBC World News Channel is a commercial channel that takes advertising. So it is a different element of the BBC completely. BBC One does not take advertising.
You know, Nigel Farage,
Yes.
MP, is he kind of a Donald Trump, British Donald Trump?
Well, he's similar in idiocy, I think. Nigel Farage is not an MP, by the way, of the British Parliament. He's an MEP. He tried to be a British Parliament. He's tried in Kent. He tried in Thanet to be elected. He's tried 3 times and he hasn't been elected. He has, though, changed the debate about Europe in the UK, because suddenly we are, through Nigel Farage, we had to consider immigration in a different way. If you remember, Tony Blair wanted to invite people in, and they said that people come to this country and bring their skills, and we can develop the economy as such. So we open our doors to Poland, we open our doors to Romania. I saw in the papers today, 1 million Poles, just over, living in the UK, 400,000 Romanians. This used to be a welcoming country. You may find it yourselves in the work that you do here in London, that there are people now who don't find it so welcoming. Particularly people who are from the European Union and are not quite sure whether they will have work permits when we leave the European Union. And there's this, well, we've had the resignation of the Home Secretary, who said there are not targets, and there obviously were political targets for getting the number of immigrants, so-called, down. And now we have in the Standard this evening the fact that we want to relax the targets so we can bring in more doctors because the NHS hasn't got enough people. You know, and I'll tell you a brief story about it. I fell off my bicycle and broke my wrist, went to the hospital, and the doctor who fixed my wrist was from Poland. The nurse who fixed my wrist was from Spain, and 2 other people, this was late, so they were doing the night shift, so it wasn't the British who were doing the night shift, and 2 other people who helped me, one was from Romania and the other one I think was from Portugal. So I said, before you treat me, I have to apologise for Brexit, okay? Because we need you all here. But Nigel Farage changed the debate in the UK so that it became a less tolerant country. And so to that extent, he was successful. But I think it's the ultimate irony for Nigel Farage is that he earns his living within an institution that he hates and wants to destroy. So he's going to Brussels every week to work as an MEP, to work for an institution that pays him, that he hates and wants to leave. So, but you know, there's a financial reality and there's a political reality, and they are different. So,
maybe he lost his market for the German makers.
Yeah,
that's why he says they are monsters, mafia.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, my friend found out this, his argument, I guess. I don't know what.
Maybe it's a fake news.
Maybe number 10 approves what the board appointed.
It's fake news.
Where's it from?
It's a BBC.
Oh, BBC Media, yeah. 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 After number 10 approval, everything has to go through number 10 anyway for the higher ups. Even if, and some people, the number 10 didn't approve, but they were appointed anyway. So, you know, that's it. But I have to tell you now, the chairman of the BBC has virtually no power within the BBC at all. He might be chairman, but it's for external welcoming to people that he's the chairman of the BBC. The person who does have the power is the Director General, who's below the chairman, who is the one who runs the BBC, and that's Tony Hall at the moment. When I was at the BBC, he was in charge of news and current affairs, and he was vehemently for the impartiality of the BBC. So, you know, you might want to argue with me that the BBC is an organ of government, and I will never say it is, right? Because I've worked within it, I know it isn't, right? I know that some governments have absolutely hated the BBC. Margaret Thatcher, who I once got an interview with when I was at the BBC, couldn't stand the BBC because she thought it was too left-wing. Neil Kinnock, who was of the opposition left one, thought that we were all too right-wing at the BBC. So that's how you want it. You want people who are mutually suspicious and therefore don't trust you, either one or the other. But if in Mongolia now you have a situation where the government controls everything, it's funny to say this in the embassy, that's not healthy. They won't allow me out. You know?
So your current company
Yes.
is specializing in China, Chinese affairs.
Well, my current company is Marylebone Media, and it's based here in London. It's based in Marylebone, that's why it's called that. But I have been reporting on and doing work in China for the last 10 years. So the Chinese government said to, well, I'll take a step back. I worked with the Chinese ambassador in London, Fu Ying, when she was here, the first female ambassador for China. And I said to her, whenever the BBC discusses China, the ambassador never comes on air. They do what's called the empty chair. We invited the ambassador, but they refused. I said, couldn't you be the first ambassador to represent China? To go on the Today programme, to go on the Andrew Marr programme, onto Newsnight, onto many different news programmes, and put the Chinese point of view. And I will train you to do that. So I would say to the ambassador, I think you should go on the Andrew Marr political programme, and I would become Andrew Marr in practice sessions to give for the questions. And she had a tendency, Fu Ying, to lose her temper very quickly. And we would film the practice sessions, and I would ask her such a provocative question that she would lose her temper. And I said, by the way, I've just won, because you've lost your temper on camera, and it makes perfect television, so you must not do that, right? No matter, she said, you're just being provocative. And I said, well, don't you think the BBC journalists will be provocative and try and catch you out? You've got to have your argument prepared and ready for it, for whoever you're going to meet. And I explained to them what the programmes were like and what the questioning would be like. I became Jon Snow when she came on Channel 4 News. We practiced that as well. But she did go on air and defend the Chinese government's position. Now, I wouldn't always do that because I think in some bits it was indefensible. But anyway, I would ask the questions that she wouldn't get asked in the embassy. Let me put it like that. Because I wasn't part of the embassy. So then she talked to Beijing and said, we ought to train our young diplomats in how to deal with the Western media. So for 2 years, I went to Beihai University in Beijing, and I met the top diplomats from every department of the Chinese government, and we did a rigorous training on interviews, on public speaking, on presentation, on dealing with television journalists who just doorstep you in the street. And I have to tell you, these diplomats were absolutely brilliant. But at the end of a course, they would say, you know, this is fantastic information and skills that you're giving us, but we'll never get a chance to use it because my boss will never agree. And I thought, well, that's not going to change much, is it, if their boss will never agree? And the bosses wanted me to do the course because it showed that they were developing their staff, but they would never allow their staff to go on air anyway. because they would go on air. So I wasn't changing anything really. So after 2 years, I stopped doing that. So I would spend 2 weeks with the Chinese army, teaching them how to deal with the Western media, and then they would say, well, we're building an aircraft carrier, and and we're going to create all these islands and the Spratly Islands because we want to defend our interests. And I said, how much is that defence and how much is that attack? Because you're defending your interests by building aircraft carriers. Oh, China is not a territorial grabber. We are happy, we're just defending the land that we have. And I said, you're going to have to revise that because you've now got 3 aircraft carriers. You've now got missiles based on the islands. And now China has its first overseas military base in Djibouti. So China is becoming a much more aggressive member of the world community. It will never attack anyone, but you can see that the invisible hand of China is behind the fact that the North Korean summit with Donald Trump is not happening. He summoned the Chinese summoned Kim over to China twice to say, we're worried about this, we don't think you're ready for it, and what happens? The summit does not happen. But they manoeuvred it so that Donald Trump said it's not going to happen. Well, he doesn't read anything, does he? He doesn't read any briefing notes, he's purely instinct, and he operates on a gut feeling, and he's not a diplomat, he's not a politician, he's not an intellectual, but he is the president. So there's a terrible combination of skills there that we've all got to deal with. So China is being very, very active in lots of countries, and China is secretly, and not secretly, but economically and financially developing the future of Africa, by securing raw materials there, building railway lines, building new ports. And China's Belt and Road Initiative, which you must hear about in Mongolia because they talk of nothing else, is a way of tying the neighbours into China's influence financially. So we will fund your new railway line, but we want it to have a priority of taking Chinese freight. Now, I don't know how much Chinese investment there is in Mongolia. You've always had a difficult relationship, but they're not going to let a country that is sandwiched between two giants, because there's a suspicion between China and Russia, there's a suspicion between China and India, and you are very useful to have just there sometimes, as a listening post, if nothing else. So China's influence in Mongolia, I don't know, is it political? Does Chinese money fund some Mongolian politicians? I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
There are suspicions, but
there are suspicions.
You
yes.
can't prove it.
No, you can't. You can't prove it because they like to have quiet influence over the territory that they are close to, and the quiet influence with the South Koreans and with the North Koreans is there for all to see. How they practice that in Mongolia, I simply don't know. But we've ranged far and wide. I don't know whether you've got any final few questions for me. Hello. Have you been Mongolian wrestling?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. I'll tell you one brief story about my first visit to Mongolia. Yes.
Can I quick interrupt?
Yes.
Before your question. Story.
Yes.
Are you gonna go to Mongolia again?
Yes.
Okay. Are you gonna have some training or to our journalism? That
I would.
Free press means is in the essence of a journalism. It's shedding a light on the transparency, etc., for
Yes.
the interest of the public.
Yes.
It's not yellow press that are serving some individual or private or
Yes.
the guts and ugliness and disgusting things that they pursue.
Yes.
Would you be willing to
I
do
would
that?
love to go back to Mongolia, and I'd love to do that. I know when I first went that the Norwegians were putting a lot of money into the training of journalists. There was a Norwegian-run press centre, I'm sure I'm right, at that stage, discussing Norwegian journalism and how they could develop it.
Well, obviously it failed, yeah. Because for us, the free press means it's a yellow press. That's what
It's a yellow press,
yeah,
right?
but this is not.
I would love to go and talk to
Yeah,
your
so-
press, and I think it's about time I went back there. And I don't hold back in my comments about it, and I can be criticised whatever you want. But for me, a free press is absolutely essential to the development of a country, because you can't have untramelled power anywhere. It must be accountable. And the only way of accounting for that is through the press and through a lively TV, media and online debate. I also contribute to the Private Eye magazine here in the UK. I write some bits for iWorld, and Private Eye is a thorn in the side for lots of organisations because it doesn't hold back. And I think that's a good thing sometimes. It shows your society for warts and all, but sometimes it helps to have that debate opened up. And would the whole debate about the Windrush generation and immigration have come out without one journalist, Carol Cadwallader of The Guardian, spending 5 years working on this story? Would the government, would the Home Secretary have resigned under pressure because of all her work? And it was journalism, it was the work of a journalist that actually brought this out. And then the other journalist was about data and data exploitation. Another Guardian journalist, and suddenly data, and Mark Zuckerberg is sitting in front of the European Union and the MP and in the American Congress, trying to answer questions that he hasn't been asked before because he's a billionaire and he doesn't want to answer them. So my argument is that everyone should be accountable, and you can't have anyone either above the law or feel that they can get away with anything. So